for investigators, several developments. From Brian Ross, one of our key investigative reporters, FBI agents conducting searches and raids in Florida, looking for an individual who they want to question in connection with this. The Florida connection is not something we have the details on what led them there. More apparent, the Boston connection. At Logan Airport, we are told that a commuter got in a traffic dispute with a carload full of men, that he thought little of it at the time he boarded his flight, went to his destination, and then learned of the attack and that it was a flight from Boston. So he then called the Massachusetts State Police, reported it, and directed them to the car that the men were parking at the time they had this argument. The Massachusetts State Police bomb-sniffing dog assigned to Logan Airport went over the car along with an FBI bomb tech, evidence recovery team, and what they found were rental documents that led them to an identity of an individual.
Do they know where the car was rented?
Apparently in Portland and then driven to Boston, a national rent-a-car vehicle. A videotape, which our sources say is an instructional video on how to pilot a commercial aircraft. The men apparently were running late for the flight, maybe the root of the dispute with the other guy, perhaps over the parking space, but their luggage did not make the flight. So now the FBI is processing their luggage, in which sources say there are Arabic language training manuals on flying. They've developed 5 names, and I'm trying to learn whether those names match up with the passenger names they were looking at. But interestingly, investigators tell us 2 of them are brothers. One of them is supposed to be a pilot. So we are starting to see, in the very early stages of the investigation, hints that there is a level of professionalism and proficiency with aircraft if these are the right people that they're looking at.
Now, in the Florida connection, the name of a flight school emerges this morning.
Correct, and there's some fog there because the man they're looking for worked at a flight school. A man who is living in that location works at the airport. We're not certain what those connections mean yet.
We don't know. Do we know that one of the men for whom they have a warrant in Florida actually did train at, I believe it's called the Embry Flight School in Florida? Do we know, can we go that far at this point?
I had heard that reported by Brian Ross this morning, whose sources on the federal side are usually impeccable.
ABC News has also learned that at least 2 of the hijackers/terrorists were on the FBI watch list, which is exactly what it says it is. It's a watch list, watch for these people, and it's still unclear, our investigative unit tells us, whether these individuals entered the United States illegally or whether they entered before their names were actually placed on the list. So we do not know at this point whether these are men who'd been in the country. There'd been some reports around, I think, quoting in part the governor of Maine, Angus King, who was the first person I heard say that these men had rented the car at Portland and driven down to Boston. All this is very close to the Canadian border, so there's some questions this morning about men getting into the country, but I gather it's not very hard at the moment.
Not very hard. Oh, the information not very hard. I thought you were saying it's not very hard to get in from Canada.
Well, that's also true along much of the Canadian-American border.
It's looked on as a soft point, and you know, having studied this very closely, Chris Isham from the investigative unit and I had the opportunity several weeks ago to debrief a member of Osama bin Laden's intelligence team. It was a very rare opportunity. And he told us some very interesting things, and this will become the subject of a story later. But what he said was there was a training school at bin Laden's camp, and that militants from France, from Italy, from London, from all over the world were there in a multi-month training school where they were drilled through surveillance, counter-surveillance, explosives, and so on. The interesting thing he said that day was that there was several young men from Canada, and that bin Laden took them aside, away from the rest of the class, and held a 3-hour private session with the Canadians. The significance to us at the time was certainly, well, that's the easiest, closest jumping off point to run an operation in America. It's where the operation that was directed at Los Angeles International Airport by Ahmed Rassam, who the federal authorities say is connected to bin Laden, jumped off from. It's where the device was made. So there was a little bit of history here. I cannot help today thinking back on that and wondering if that wasn't the beginnings of a cell that moved from Canada to Maine to Boston.
I just want to make a quick correction here, because the information I gave you about the hijackers being on the watch list, it's not the FBI watch list, of course. It is the INS watch list, the Immigration Naturalization Service watch list, and they're the ones who watch. And just to make one observation about the American-Canadian border, it's been called since time immemorial the longest undefended border in the world, because the two nations are close, and it is fairly porous in places, and there's been some considerable pressure by American authorities on the Canadians to try to increase their surveillance capacity along the border.
Especially since the Rassam incident, which was the planned millennium bombing of Los Angeles airport. But the watch list, the INS watch list, most often the names that are on the watch list either come from the FBI or the CIA. And it is a watch list. It's not a want list. It doesn't mean you're to be arrested. It means you're to be detained, that your identity is to be made certain if your name matches one on the watch list. Ironically, if we go back through the history of these events that we've talked about for 2 days that we all know so well, Sheikh Abdel Rahman, the blind sheikh who was the inspirational leader convicted of inspiring the World Trade Center bombers, was on a watch list when he arrived at Newark Airport, and there was no one available to interview him or debrief him, so they let him in.